Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.
Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. As the 250th anniversary of America's independence approaches, dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. Without a professional army, a professional navy, or military industries, American independence was pretty unlikely without assistance from powerful European nations. To help us explore these unlikely alliances, we're joined by...
Hello, my name is Sam Florer. I'm the Director of Public Programs with the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I recently helped co-curate one of the VMHC's most recent exhibitions, Revolutionary Allies, Foreign Friends of American Independence.
After its 1763 victory in the 7 Years' War, Britain stood as the world's leading superpower. Embarrassed and embittered by the treaty that ended the 7 Years' War, France and Spain looked for opportunities to weaken the British.
The French and the Spanish were feeling very uncertain about the future with Britain being so much more powerful. And the way these European powers worked was not having one country being the most powerful, because then they could dictate kind of these other countries how trade and politics would go forward. And so with Britain being by far and away the most powerful after the 7 Years' War, France and Spain and many other European powers all kind of agreed behind closed doors that they were going to have to do something before too long to kind of humble Britain and bring Britain down a few pegs to make them more equal on the world stage. When the revolution begins and colonial unrest begins in the late 1770s, France and Spain both see the unrest in the colonies as a potential opportunity, because the North American colonies are extremely valuable to the British Empire. They add a lot of population. There's a lot of raw resources that makes the British Empire the power that it is. And so if there's unrest in these colonies, there's the potential to maybe break those colonies away from Britain and weaken them on the world stage. And so as the revolution starts kicking off in the 1770s, especially France will want to jump in quickly to make the revolution happen, to not let the British crush it before it can get started. The Spanish and the Dutch have different motives and have different levels of enthusiasm for the revolution for different reasons. But everyone kind of sees this as somewhat of an opportunity.
But in 1775, those nations were not natural allies of the revolution. In addition to religious differences, American colonists had a long history of fighting against both nations and their powerful monarchs. However, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic eventually joined the American cause and turned the revolution into a global war of empires.
When we talk about the American Revolution and foreign powers assisting the Patriot cause, you know, France and Spain and the Dutch, we talk about like, oh, yes, they loved America. They wanted to support us, and we were super happy to have their support. But it was not a natural alliance. And you just think of history. So before the revolution, colonists were very happy subjects of the King of Britain. And France and Spain were the natural enemies of Britain for hundreds of years. So many colonists had personal experience fighting against the French in the French and Indian War in North America. Thousands of colonists fought for the British Army in America. Hundreds, thousands of colonists fought against the Spanish in other colonial wars too. The colonists allying themselves with France and Spain was not a natural thing for them. But I think this is one of the best examples of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so everyone involved was the enemy of the British Empire in the 1770s. And so they all kind of looked past their differences to work together to defeat Britain.
If they wanted a fighting chance against the British, they would need help. You name it. Money, supplies, men, they needed it all. So how exactly did these revolutionaries actually secure the support? It started with some Americans in Paris who were already working to drum up interest and aid from European nations. The Continental Congress named 3 official commissioners, or representatives, to work on this: Benjamin Franklin, Virginian Arthur Lee, and Silas Deane.
So Americans who are operating on behalf of Congress, trying to get European support, come from a lot of different backgrounds. One is a Virginian, Arthur Lee. Arthur Lee was already in London in the 1770s. He was a doctor, a lawyer, and in the 1770s, he was serving as a commercial agent, but also as a colonial representative for Massachusetts, arguing on behalf of Massachusetts' interests in front of Parliament. He was a close friend of oppositional leaders, people who were more sympathetic in English politics with the revolutionary position and thought the English government was going too far. He actually helps his brother William get elected as an alderman in London. So he's an elected local British official, and he runs for a seat in Parliament that he closely loses. So it's interesting to think that, American colonists, before the revolution starts, many of them are active members of British government and trying to get these changes to happen within the system. Once that is no longer possible, the revolution begins. Very quickly, Congress will ask Arthur Lee to start serving as a secret representative of their interests. And so he will be one of America's first spies. He was listening in on British government policy. He was following British troop movements, naval movements, and sending that information back to America. So he will initially start kind of doing this, getting French support clandestinely and on an unofficial basis. But eventually, Congress will move to sending official representatives to the French court to advocate more openly and more strongly for the French to actually enter the war. And so Arthur Lee will join Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane as the 3 principal American commissioners in Paris.
Benjamin Franklin becomes somewhat of a star of the American mission in France during the Revolution. Having spent years in London and understanding European society, he charmed the French elite with stories, drinking, flirtation, and theatrical frontier imagery. He donned a raccoon skin cap and furs to play into the French fantasies about these rugged backwoods Americans. Franklin understood that winning French support required patience, backroom diplomacy, and social maneuvering. Arthur Lee, on the other hand, despised this style. Instead of reading the room like Franklin, Lee could be blunt, rigid, and deeply suspicious, insisting the Americans should openly demand loans and military aid instead of playing the French game. Despite this, he was surprisingly effective in securing aid. And as for Silas Deane, the other American commissioner, he was busy not only securing supplies for the Continental Army, but also secretly profiting from wartime trade. With normal commerce disrupted by the British blockade, Deane bought and shipped goods for private profit while working as a diplomat. But let's get back to the main storyline here. These American commissioners are working out of Paris and trying to convince the French to put their weight behind the American cause of independence, that immediately want to get involved, acting both as government officials and as private individuals. Most people have heard of the Marquis de Lafayette, who was so convinced by these new American ideals that he crossed the Atlantic to serve the Patriot cause. He becomes America's favorite fighting Frenchman. And while most Americans have heard of Lafayette, a lesser-known Frenchman proved just as, if not more, important to the revolutionary cause.
The first real big figure that will be assisting the coming United States will be a French man about town. He's this fascinating character. His name was Pierre Beaumarchais. He was the son of a French watchmaker. He was a genius watchmaker. He made watches for the French court. Even though he came from like a middle-class working background, he very quickly ingratiated himself with the nobility of France and worked his way up the ladder. He taught piano to King Louis XIV's children, his daughters. Or King Louis XV's daughters. He married into wealthy families and got power that way. And then right at the start of the revolution, he also wrote 2 best-selling plays. The Barber of Seville came first. The Marriage of Figaro came second. Mozart would then make The Marriage of Figaro into a really famous opera. So he was just this really unique person. And in the 1770s, he had also, through his being in the French court, he had become close confidants with the new foreign minister of France. His name was the Comte de Vergennes. And Vergennes had it out for the British. He was intent on getting revenge from the 7 Years' War, and Beaumarchais had similar thoughts. So Vergennes sent Beaumarchais to London to kind of serve as a spy and to get information on the British government, how they were reacting to the growing imperial crisis. And while in London, Beaumarchais will make contact with Arthur Lee. That conversation will very quickly lead to that the revolutionaries are going to need support. So the colonies do not have much industry. They don't have standing armies. They are incapable of winning a conventional war without foreign assistance. So we really can't stress why assistance is important, because it wouldn't have happened without it. There just wasn't the stuff here, and there wasn't the capability to make enough stuff without us buying it. So Beaumarchais will see that there's this need, and he will successfully petition Vergennes, and the King of France will give his permission as well to start aiding the revolution. And this is in 1776, so right after really the revolution is underway. And Beaumarchais will set up a shell company to do this business with, because France is not at war with Britain. And the French government is not ready to go to war against Britain yet. They are still recovering after the 7 Years' War. They're rebuilding their military, and they want to wait until they know that the revolutionaries can succeed before they put a lot at stake by going formally to war. The shell company has a Spanish name, and that was on purpose to kind of obscure that it was the French doing this. But the French government provides the money to fund this company. The Spanish government will also provide 1 million livres to fund the purchase of supplies as well. But Beaumarchais is all doing this kind of as a private individual. And so he uses this government backing. He raises money on his own, and he starts purchasing huge amounts of secondary used French and Spanish weaponry, gunpowder, tents, really anything and everything that an army might need to fight in war: rope, grenades, buckles. He gathers all this equipment together, and he will start shipping it to the revolutionaries. And much of this equipment will arrive in the spring of 1777, and that's right before several big important military campaigns happen in the American Revolution, most notably culminating in the American success at the Battle of Saratoga in the fall of 1777. And much of the equipment that the American Army is using at Saratoga is coming directly from Beaumarchais shipments that arrived earlier that year. So Beaumarchais will send millions and millions of livres, French currency, in supplies to the revolution, and was really critical in sustaining the cause at that early point. And that support bridges the gap between the start of the revolution and then formal French intervention.
Even before an official alliance was made between the new United States and France, the British were well aware of France's covert support. Despite the elaborate cover stories and shell companies, Britain had an extensive spy network that discovered the plot.
So even though the Beaumarchais uses this shell company, the British have spies literally everywhere in the French government, all over Paris. And so they're immediately aware of what's going on. And the French, to play nice, because they're not ready to start a war before they're ready to, they play along. And so at one point, Vergennes orders Beaumarchais ships to not leave port. He orders them to be unloaded of all their military supplies. And then Beaumarchais, wink, wink, nod, nod, with Virginie's okay, will unload his ships during the day. And at night, he will hire extra workers and reload them really, really quickly with those supplies again. Sometimes, even though the Virginie ordered him not to leave, he pretends he didn't get the order and he sails out like the day before. So the French government is able to say, oh, we're so sorry. We didn't know this was happening. We'll put a stop to this support. But at the same time, they continue to do it. And yeah, it's really important to stress that there were not a lot of secrets.
British informants were everywhere, even inside the American delegation in Paris. Turns out Arthur Lee's paranoia may have been justified. Dean's secretary was later revealed to be a British spy. British intelligence had direct access to meetings, letters, and strategy discussions. This really just meant that publicly, the French had to act cooperative and deny any direct involvement because they weren't ready to openly go to war with Britain quite yet. They wanted to wait for the right moment, and that moment came. After the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga and Washington's bold, though unsuccessful, attack at Germantown in 1777, France became convinced that the American Revolution had a real chance of succeeding. The French government quickly began negotiating with American representatives in Paris to provide support.
By February of 1778, they sign a formal treaty of alliance. And that treaty recognizes the United States as an independent nation. That was really critical because France is now the first nation in the world to recognize the independence of the United States and its sovereignty. And they agree to enter the war on the side of the Americans. They declare war against the British, and they will start now openly sending millions and millions of livres of military support. And crucially, they'll now start sending navies and armies to America to directly assist the revolution. And so after 1778, that is a game changer for the course of the war.
One member of the Continental Congress said, "Britain at war with America, France in alliance with her. These, my friend, are astonishing changes. Perhaps one principle, self-interest, may account for it all." France entering the revolution on the side of the Americans immediately changed the balance of the war. As soon as Britain heard France had declared war, they evacuated Philadelphia, a city that they had fought hard to capture, because they feared the French Navy would blockade the Delaware River and trap their army. They also pulled about 8,000 troops out of America and sent them to defend valuable Caribbean sugar colonies from expected French attacks. France was the first domino, and other European nations would follow. Let's shift our attention to how the Spanish became part of the story.
The Spanish have different interests overall in terms of their global world empire. So the French main concern is about getting back sugar islands they lost in the Caribbean. Well, the Spanish Empire at this time includes much of South America, like Mexico, Latin America, South America. And so the gold and treasure that is coming from Central and South America, that is a huge part of their economy, which is different than these Caribbean sugar islands. So they have a focus on that. They're also, with their interests in South America, have been battling Portugal over control of Brazilian colonial interests. So colonial interests in South America, the Portuguese and the Spanish have been battling. And the British have been low-key supporting the Portuguese. And so the Spanish are not wholly just focused on subduing Britain. They have these other interests they're thinking about. And they're also more concerned about an independent United States because they still have possessions in North America that an independent, future, powerful United States might threaten. So they still control all North American lands west of the Mississippi River. Louisiana is an especially important part of their colonial empire that they're worried about encroachment on. So they want to humble Britain, but they are a little bit more lukewarm about the whole thing.
That being said, there were individual Spanish merchants and officials who saw the strategic opportunity to support the American Revolution. And they did so without an official or explicit government go-ahead. similar to what happened at first in France.
So there's a Spanish merchant named Diego Gardoqui who will be in contact with revolutionaries in Massachusetts in the lead up to Lexington and Concord in like 1774. And Massachusetts officials will order guns from him in 1774 that show up in the winter of 1775. So before Lexington and Concord even happens, the Spanish merchant has sold revolutionaries guns. There are officials in New Orleans that Virginia will send representatives to in 1776 to ask for military support, and they will send shipments of supplies up the Mississippi River all the way to Pittsburgh. And they show up in Pittsburgh, and Virginia and George Rogers Clark will use some of those supplies in his campaigns in the West. But the official Spanish government is waiting, and they're playing hard to get because the French government knows that they cannot go to war against England on their own.
In fact, the French and Spanish were both in the process of rebuilding their navies in the wake of the 7 Years' War. At the onset of the American Revolution, both countries were too small to take on the British Navy alone. So they entered a pact to go into war against the British together. Strengthen numbers, right?
So they go into this pact that they will not go to war unless both sides agree to go into together. And the Spanish, they know that they kind of have the upper hand in negotiations with the French government, and they're able to get a lot out of the French. So they eventually agree to enter the war, but they get the French to promise that the French government will assist them in recapturing two really important Spanish possessions that were captured by the British in previous imperial wars. One is the island of Minorca off the coast of Spain, and the other is Gibraltar at the tip of the Iberian Peninsula, controls access to the Mediterranean. Those were really, really important to Spanish interests. And so they get the French to promise to help them recapture those territories. And they get the French to promise that they will try to actually invade England itself, which is a pretty big deal. But the Spanish thought it was really important because they thought that if they could invade England and like capture a British seaside city, that they could then force the British to trade that city for Gibraltar or Minorca without having to like fight over them, basically. And so the Spanish and the French are negotiating.
During these negotiations, the victory at Saratoga happens, and the French feel ready to officially enter the war. Spain delayed joining for another year because it wasn't quite prepared.
Their main concern was waiting for the annual treasure fleet that sails once a year from Mexico with billions of dollars in gold and silver. They had to wait for that to arrive in Spain because that funded like 50% of their government expenses every year. So they wanted to send the fleet back while they were still at peace, because if they were at war, that would make their treasure fleet vulnerable to British attack and seizure. And so once the fleet arrived in 1778, then their hands were more freed up. And so they will then enter the war the next year in 1779 formally. But crucially, when Spain enters the war, they declare war against Britain, and they are in a formal alliance with the French, but they do not recognize the United States. And they do not enter any formal alliance with the United States. And that is because they are still wary of a future independent United States. And they don't want to get too heavily involved in our interests yet. And they kind of like know what's going on. So when they enter this agreement with the French, they say that they will not impede the United States' efforts, and they will stay in the war and negotiate together. The United States, France, and Spain will all not enter into separate peace negotiations. So there's kind of like this tacit recognition of United States interests and independence, but it's not formal.
The French, during the American Revolution, get the most credit for their assistance, and for good reason. They're the first to covertly assist. Then they're the first to recognize the United States as a sovereign nation. They send 12,000 plus soldiers to fight in the United States alongside the Continental Army. They send dozens and dozens of their biggest battleships to American waters to assist the revolutionary cause. Their assistance is very direct. Spanish assistance is less direct, but arguably just as influential. They are sending money and supplies, like the French, But their global military efforts are also crucial to how the revolution plays out.
So once the Spanish join the war, their principal aim against the British are capturing Gibraltar, capturing Minorca, invading England. Those things have a mixed track record. They do recapture Minorca. They besiege Gibraltar alongside the French. It's actually the longest siege in British military history, tens of thousands of soldiers involved on both sides. They're ultimately unsuccessful in recapturing Gibraltar. They try to invade England with an armada that's larger than the Spanish armada of the 1500s. That fails as well. But their efforts in North America are successful and very important. So their main aims in North America are recapturing Florida from the British. And so from their base in New Orleans, the Spanish forces will kind of march along the Gulf Coast of Florida and Alabama, recapturing British forts. So they capture Mobile, and then they start besieging the principal base on the West Florida Panhandle, Pensacola. And this effort is being led by the Spanish governor of New Orleans, Bernardo de Galvez. And the siege will go on for many months, and it's a real interesting microcosm of like the global nature of this war. So in the British fort, there are Native Americans supporting the British. There are British soldiers. There are German soldiers. There are loyalist Americans. There are Black British soldiers. On the Spanish side, there are like American militiamen, volunteers. There are Spanish soldiers from Spain. There are Spanish colonial soldiers. There are Black Spanish soldiers. There are French soldiers. There are Black French soldiers. So there are Native Americans as well. So it's like all of these nations, all of these different groups of people that have all gotten kind of wrapped into this war, fighting on different sides. The Spanish are able to capture Pensacola in May of 1781, and that was really good timing because the summer of 1781 is when Cornwallis is marching into Virginia in the Virginia campaign. Eventually, by the fall of 1781, he is at Yorktown. And at the same time, the French fleet, which is operating in the Caribbean, had gotten news from their compatriot Rochambeau, who was the French army general fighting alongside Washington, asking the French fleet to come assist Rochambeau and Washington in America. When the French admiral in the Caribbean gets that note, this admiral is Admiral de Grasse, and he gets this note, before he can leave the Caribbean, he has to check in with his Spanish allies. Because when he was sent from France to the Caribbean, his principal aims were to recapture or capture British sugar islands, to defend French sugar islands, and to help the Spanish in whatever campaigns that they were focusing on.
In 1781, French Admiral de Grasse received a request to support the American war effort in Virginia. Since Spain had already achieved its main objective by capturing Pensacola, Spanish leaders told de Grasse that they no longer needed his assistance. As a result, Spain allowed and encouraged de Grasse to sail to Virginia with his entire fleet and 3,000 French soldiers, while Spanish ships protected French Caribbean territories, helping to make the Yorktown campaign possible. In addition to needing de Grasse's support for the campaign, Rochambeau also urgently needed money to pay both French and American troops. De Grasse tried to raise silver from French officials and wealthy planters in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, but they refused because previous loans to the French government had not been properly repaid.
So de Grasse tells the Spanish officials in the Caribbean, and this principal official is Francisco Saavedra, about his problem, and Saavedra says, I'll help you out. So Saavedra sails to Havana and asks the planters and government officials of Havana for this money, and they raise the money in a single day. They raise over 1 million livres in silver coins in a single day. And the reason why that was so much easier in Havana is because Havana is very close to Mexico, where all of Spain's silver and gold comes from. So they're not as concerned about being repaid from the Spanish or French governments because they know all of that hard money is so close by. So they raise that money very quickly. Saavedra gives it to de Grasse, and de Grasse brings 1.2 million livres in silver coins to Yorktown. And that money was critical to pay the French, to pay the American soldiers there, to buy supplies. There's a great story, whether it's true or not, I'm not sure, but I love it, is that when all of those coins were offloaded off the French ships, they were given to a French officer to look after in Williamsburg. And the chest was so heavy that it broke through the floor of the house that they were staying at. And the officer wakes up in the middle of the night after hearing this crash, and one of his servants is like hanging by a floorboard because there's a hole in the floor of the chest of silver coins.
Financial support for the American Revolution came through a complex mix of loans and gifts. Arrangements were often informal and involved governments, private agents, and intermediaries. So it was not always super clear whether funds were outright gifts or loans that were meant to be repaid.
But it's pretty remarkable the amount of stuff that they gave. So it's hard to convert 18th century money into modern money, but some historians have tried to do so. And the estimates are the French provided more than $68 billion in monetary and military support, and the Spanish $16 billion. So, more than like $80 billion combined in support. And when you put that into like modern day money, when you think about like how much countries are supporting like the Ukraine and these big wars that are going on, the United States has provided like $100-some billion in support. So more, but not by a lot more. And that's a lot of stuff. So it's a lot. And putting it into context of like actual stuff. So estimates are that the Continental Army, that 90% of the guns and the gunpowder that they used came from France or Spain. So they would have been incapable of fighting without this support.
As we've seen, the Spanish and French do and should get a lot of credit for their support of the American cause. But other nations were also offering Americans aid, including the Dutch. While the Dutch were no longer a major military power by the time of the American Revolution, they were still an important trading nation.
They are interested in supporting the revolution. Many of them also have these political sympathies with the revolution too. And so one great figure is Jean de Neufville. He was a banker in Amsterdam, and he has commercial ties with the United States prior to the revolution. And so when the war begins, he's a huge booster of the revolutionary cause. They say that any American that comes to the Netherlands always meets with de Neufville. So he was always interested in helping. He will personally help resupply and arm John Paul Jones, the famous American naval commander, who, after attacking British ships off the coast of England, will seek refuge in Dutch waters, which was a neutral nation, and his ships were damaged and they needed supplies, and de Neufville will personally pay for all these supplies, and again, go into huge amounts of personal debt because he does so with the promise from Benjamin Franklin that he will repay him afterwards. Franklin even says, like, America is a great friend and we will repay your kindness in due course. And of course, the American government never does. So a lot of this is like personal support. A lot of it is business banking support. John Adams is able to negotiate a pretty sizable loan from the Dutch government, but it's paid by private banks. The government just kind of like approves of it. So most of that support is commercial and monetary.
So they stayed neutral at first and made money by selling goods to different sides in the conflict. But Britain eventually became frustrated with this trade and moved against the Dutch, pulling them more directly into the war.
The Dutch finally get involved in the actual war itself because of a diplomatic dispute. So William Lee, who is the brother of Arthur Lee, Virginia's diplomat in Paris, William is also serving as a commercial agent of the United States and negotiating loans and things in several different European nations. And he will meet with de Neufville, and they write a draft treaty of alliance. And the treaty was just a draft, and it would only go into effect if and when the Netherlands decided to actually enter the war. That treaty gets taken back to the United States. The United States is really excited about it. And so they send an American politician, Henry Laurens from South Carolina. They send him as to serve as like a more official representative of Congress in the Netherlands to help make this treaty come to fruition. While Lawrence is sailing to Europe, a British ship captures his ship, and he tries to throw this treaty off into the ocean, but it doesn't sink fast enough. And the British pick it up and read it. And it's this very incendiary thing. It's this neutral country saying that they're going to enter into an alliance with their rebellious colonies. And so they protest super heavily against the Dutch. The Dutch were like, we don't know what this is. Like, this is not our official thing. This was done unofficially between this banker and an American diplomat. But the British use this as pretext for declaring war against the Dutch because they were mad at the Dutch for trading with the United States. They knew how much supplies were going through Dutch colonies and Dutch banking houses. And so they were mad at the Dutch and they wanted to go to war with them. And so this was an excuse they could use. They were also worried, the British were also worried that the Dutch were about to enter this other diplomatic alliance called the League of Armed Neutrality. And this is this kind of obscure but interesting side note of European diplomacy where Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, was interested in Spain, France, and Britain all not really getting too powerful after this. They were also interested in defending the rights of their merchant fleets to continue to trade with any of these nations who might be at war with one another without having their ships seized by the navies of the warring nations. And so Catherine the Great will ask other neutral nations to join in this League of Armed Neutrality, basically saying, like, we will all declare war against any nation that tries to seize our neutral merchant ships. And so Denmark joins, Sweden joins, Prussia joins, Austria eventually joins. So all of the kind of like B players of European diplomacy will all join up and are all kind of aligned against England because England was the main aggressor seizing these merchant ships. And the Dutch were also about to join. And because the British were especially interested in seizing Dutch ships, they knew that this might pose a really big problem if the Dutch enter this League of Armed Neutrality. And so they declare war before they're able to enter that league.
So when we say this is a global war, that's not an exaggeration. Battles were fought on every continent except for Australia and Antarctica.
We can even pull out even farther and look to India. One of the very last battles of the American Revolution takes place in June of 1783. So more than 6 months after the preliminary peace agreements were signed between all the warring powers. And this battle is happening on the east coast of India between the French and the British and Indian allies on both sides who were battling over control of trade routes. The war is truly a global war with hundreds of thousands of soldiers from dozens of countries fighting over what might seem to us obscure places, trading posts that don't have direct impact on American interests, really, but showing how there are these broader trends and interests around the world.
At this point, you may be wondering if the British had any outside support. And the short answer is not really. They did not have official support from any European nations, and instead they relied mainly on alliances with some Native American nations and support from German soldiers, commonly known as Hessians. The British hired more than 30,000 troops from several German principalities, a common practice in 18th century European warfare. Many of these German soldiers fought throughout the war, but a significant number never returned home. Some were captured, particularly after Saratoga, and were held in areas with large German-speaking populations, such as Pennsylvania and Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. There, many found opportunities to settle in America, and a substantial portion deserted the British cause and remained in the United States after the war. Britain began peace negotiations with the United States in Paris immediately following their defeat at Yorktown.
When Britain and the United States enter into peace negotiations after news of Yorktown gets back to Europe, they immediately start talking to one another as opposed to all talking with the French and the Spanish like they promised to do, because the British realize they can get better terms if they work with them one-on-one. And the Americans are eager to get good terms quickly, as opposed to waiting and putting their interests second to France and Spain. France gets very mad about this at first, but eventually they're like, we get it. And so France and Spain signed their preliminary peace negotiations with Britain several months after America had already signed our preliminary peace negotiations with Britain. So it's not a huge difference, but they did go behind France and Spain's back because they knew that France and Spain were trying to go behind their back. So it was all kind of like, who is going to like make the best deal first? But the immediate ramifications of the war, so Spain by far comes out the best from all of these powers that assist the United States. They are able to get West and East Florida back, which is one of their principal goals. They recaptured Minorca, and they also are able to expel some British colonies in Central America, like in Honduras, that they were mad about. The French don't get much out of the war. Pretty much the French and the British, they capture different possessions of one another in the Caribbean, and they basically just trade them all back at the end of the war. And then the Dutch, it's kind of the same thing with them. They don't get any major territorial changes either. And they actually come out kind of behind because they lose a lot of ships to the British in naval engagements and lose some of their stature around the world as well.
For the European allies, the American Revolution largely achieved its main strategic goal, weakening Great Britain and restoring a balance of power by helping to create an independent United States. Once peace treaties were signed and major diplomatic agreements were settled, many of the individuals who had personally financed, supplied, or advocated for the revolution were left to sort out their own claims.
They really put their own money and careers on the line and ended up losing those careers, basically, because of their support for the revolution. Silas Deane dealt with Beaumarchais, and he said, quote, "He has done more for America than any other person on this side of the ocean. He has made our affairs entirely his own." So that kind of speaks to how committed some of these guys were as individuals, like Beaumarchais, like de Neufville. They're doing it for these Enlightenment reasons. They're also doing it because they think they're going to make money. So Beaumarchais and de Neufville are charging interest basically on some of these loans. And they're assuming that the American government is going to pay that interest, is going to send them supplies back. Beaumarchais was very interested in getting tobacco from Virginia and other southern colonies because that was so valuable in the 18th century economy. And he was going to use that to pay himself back and also buy more supplies. They always had issues getting enough tobacco over. So yeah, they're doing it for these Enlightenment ideas. They're doing it to make money. They're also doing it, I think, to support their national interests. We have this really cool letter from this guy. His name was Peter Pinay, and he's writing to the governor of Virginia from Paris. And he's like, I bought all this stuff because you said you were going to send me tobacco, and all these French merchants are asking for the tobacco. And so he's like, I need this tobacco because all these French merchants are asking to be paid. And like, I just bought all this here, and they never send it to him. The Virginia government says, we did not agree to that. And then this guy is just like left high and dry.
Some, like Beaumarchais and other merchants, had risked their fortunes and careers on the American cause, only to spend years and even decades fighting for repayment or recognition, with some never fully recovering their losses. Foreign support, especially from France and Spain, was essential to the American victory. But it's unclear if all of these European leaders recognized that they were backing something much bigger than just a war against Britain. One Spanish official said in 1780, as the war waged on, "What is not being thought about at present and what ought to occupy the whole attention of politics is the great upheaval that in time the North American Revolution is going to produce in the human race." He saw the writing on the wall that ideas about liberty and self-government might eventually also inspire challenges to European systems of power. Thanks so much to Sam Florer for sharing his insights on today's episode. Join us next time as we look to the Western campaigns of the war.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
I'm Maggie Creech, host of Revolution Revisited. If this podcast has changed how you think about the American Revolution, or just made history come alive again, I'd love your help. Leave a rating or a short review wherever you listen. It only takes a minute, and it helps us amplify Virginia's history, connecting new listeners to the past and supporting the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Thank you for being part of the story.
For 250 years, Virginia's story has been shaped by people from many places and the traditions, ideas, and dreams they've brought with them. We the People, a new exhibition at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, explores the stories of achievement and resilience and communities of those who have immigrated to the Commonwealth. Learn more and get tickets at virginiahistory.org/we the people.